able to read code, because this is what we're actually going to ask our presenters. And this code should be shared freely afterwards, as long as we're able to get it from them. But the idea is to have a very vibrant community feeling with a broad coverage, not only programming languages or some specifics of one platform. We want to bring everything to one conference.
Okay, that sounds great. And let me ask you about it just maybe from a slightly different angle. Developers have a lot of events they go to throughout the year, for example, and a budget for travel. Maybe they have to choose to not go to one thing in order to come to Index. How do you encourage them to make that choice?
What we all have to admit is that the biggest challenge in our fast-moving industry is actually education and that lifelong learning thing, right? So, and Index is the one place for you to go. Instead of spending a fortune on attending various vendor events, Index gives that broad perspective, this variety of learning experiences across technologies and methodologies in just one place, right? You get a chance to brush up your software development and architecture skills in just 3 days and be ready for the year ahead. Honestly, we won't solve that lifelong learning problem completely, but we'll give you a solid head start, and this is what Index stands for me.
3 days to prepare for a year. I like that. So any closing thoughts that you want to share with those who haven't decided yet to go to Index?
Yeah, now that you learned everything about Index and why I'm so excited about Index, and I actually can't wait to be there, I would love to see you there and welcome you and attend all the workshops and sessions, at least as many as you can. Remember, it's 8 parallel tracks. It's a lot of content. It's the best presenters that we can get our hands on across the board, across our industry, everything that's relevant for your job tomorrow. So make sure to be there.
All right, that's Marcus Eisel, Director of Developer Advocacy at Lightbend. Now, one of our content leads, Kevin Allen, has been reaching out to speakers who will be at Index next week in San Francisco to get an idea of what they'll be talking about. Let's listen in to a couple of those.
As Chief Developer Advocate, you're interfacing and talking to Docker users all the time, developers who are in the technology every day. What are you hearing from them as far as the types of problems that they're solving with Docker?
When I joined Docker, initially most of our customers were using it for dev and test and CI/CD. But what we've seen after a bit of maturity, so 3 years later, now containers are adopted everywhere. So all the companies we're talking to are adopting containers, and their main use case is for modernization of their existing applications. So basically, they're taking old applications that are often monolithic, most often in .NET or Java, that live on bare metal servers or virtualization, and they're containerizing them as a first step towards deploying them to modern infrastructure, either on-prem on top of Docker Enterprise Edition on bare metal, or in the cloud. And so very often that goes with a move towards the cloud, towards needing a hybrid architecture.
Right.
And only the first part of that modernization, where the second part is about breaking down the monolith, eventually refactoring it into microservices, or even more often not touching it, but just adding functionality to it in the form of either microservices or serverless functions. And you actually saw a great example of that at the last DockerCon that the IBM team led, showing the end-to-end life cycle of that, taking the Java Pet Store application from 2002 and making it a modern application running on top of Docker in IBM Cloud and leveraging the Watson intelligence services as well as Twilio. So to me, that was a great example by the IBM team.
So, you mentioned Docker's huge announcement last year that it would support Kubernetes. So I wanted to get an idea from you, what type of feedback you're hearing around that from developers who are starting to get into it and starting to use these desktop versions.
Yeah, so the feedback from developers, you can search for Docker Kubernetes Desktop on Twitter. You'll see the feedback. It's to us, it's a great validation. The feedback is super enthusiastic. A lot of developers were really tired of going through very complicated steps to set up Kubernetes on their laptop, and now they just install Docker, and it's a checkbox. You just say enable Kubernetes, and boom, you have a running one node cluster inside of your Docker desktop edition. We also get some really good feedback about the Docker Compose to Kubernetes integration, where developers who are using Docker and are using Docker Compose files to assemble all their services together in Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows. Now they can do a Docker stack deploy with that Compose file, and it will actually behind the scenes generate pods and services and deploy them to Kubernetes. So developers love that, because then they don't need to have to learn all the YAML that is involved into Kubernetes services.
Your session at Index San Francisco is going to be using Docker to build, ship, and run Kubernetes applications. So what can developers expect to get out of that session in particular?
I'll just explain how to take a sample application. Probably I'll take a Java one, either one that's old and we'll modernize it, or a brand new one that has different languages to it. Play with different Kubernetes tools on your desktop to develop that Kubernetes application, and then I'll show you how you can go to a Docker Enterprise Edition cluster and then just ship your application as a developer once you built it through Docker Trusted Registry. And then I'll take the role of the ops person who needs to deploy that application in production on a Kubernetes cluster, and how they can use Docker Enterprise Edition to do that. So I'll show the Compose integration, same thing on the other side, on the ops side, all the controls you have there, how you can monitor and look at what's happening in your application, and how you can look at or configure networking for it, logging, monitoring, and things like that. So I'll try to do an end-to-end session about what Kubernetes means on the desktop for developers, and what does it mean on the server side for operations people using Docker Enterprise Edition.
Well, Patrick, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it.
We need you at Index Conference. So please come join us. It should be fun.
Absolutely, absolutely. There'd be so many Docker experts, so many Kube experts. It's going to be, it'll be fun. So, you know, obviously you're talking to developers all the time, every day in your job. So I want to know, from your perspective, what are you seeing as the biggest priorities for developers, especially as it relates to the web platform?
Yeah, I see a lot of my colleagues actually working really hard to capture what developers need these days, especially web developers, and what the web needs, right? So trying to marry those two of what the people working towards creating on the web and what the actual platform needs are, and making sure that those two things fit. And reading this document, you know, the most common phrase is, it's hard. Like, X is hard. Getting CSS Grid to work is hard. Convincing my boss to transition from app to web, you know, progressive web apps, it's hard. So the loud and clear message is, how do we make things easier or more accessible for developers to be able to utilize this wonderful thing called the World Wide Web? You know, the power of the web is tremendous, but there's this disconnect between how do we get there? How do we get to use that power and distribute it? So the two words I'm looking at is accessibility and just distribution. And helping web developers understand how to utilize their skills, techniques, and then again, going beyond the conference mindset. You know, you go to a lot of conferences, you sit around, it's very passive. You know, what can you do to learn more and bring it back, bring those skill sets back to your employers, to your organizations, to your group, you know, to your Scrum team, to make development process work better. So I might not know all the code. I might not be, you know, the best person to tell you how to fix that line, but I think, you know, my passion is to make sure that all of that good knowledge gets communicated to our developers.
So how do you turn from passive learning to a more active learning? You know, that's probably a big part of the work that you're doing. How do you approach that?
Yeah, so that's the hard part, right? I mean, I think a lot of the times people say, oh, let's not do any events. Let's just put some documentation up there. And, again, I'm going to boast a little bit. MDN is a great documentation site. And I think most web developers, especially, source MDN as their place to go for any answers or any new web development techniques. But documentation isn't enough. You need to connect with people, be with people, and be able to get your hands into that process. So, as we call it, in real life, events are actually quite valuable. What does that mean in terms of moving beyond just the passive, knowledge absorbing into something that's more active and proactive engagement? We're still figuring it out at Mozilla, and through Women in Code, we're creating more, small scale workshops. We're trying to do a lot more intensive sessions, really focusing on tools that have launched and seeing how does that tool fit into your workflow versus just the general JavaScript is great conference talk. Not to say JavaScript isn't great, but again, looking more towards what are those specific tools and sets that can help you.
Right. And I imagine one of the big ways that you're doing this, that you're reaching out to developers on a one-to-one basis is through the Mozilla Developer Roadshows. And that's going to be actually the key, the crux of your talk at Index. So this is a perfect segue. Can you give me a little preview of what you're going to be talking about at Index, and maybe one or two of the learnings that you've taken from the developer roadshows that that others can use to kind of buffer and hold up what they're doing in their respective communities?
So the Developer Roadshow last year was over 57 events globally. Of course, we couldn't hit every city, unfortunately. But one thing that we did do is get out of our Silicon Tech Valley bubbles, right? The Bay Area, Seattle, New York, Austin. We went to Kansas City. We went to St. Louis. We went to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. We went out to Singapore to learn about their web development community. We went out to Penang, Malaysia, places that you wouldn't think really there's web developers. Oh yeah, there's web developers and they're passionate and they want to learn more about what we're doing, not only in the Bay Area, but what everybody is doing. And that helped my team also open their eyes and say, the way we look at layout, for example, on the website from the US Western perspective doesn't work in Malaysia, or it doesn't work in a language that doesn't read left to right, on a horizontal scale. So it's, again, understanding, all right, if we want to empower our developers to build better sites, or create things that can be loaded onto websites, let's get out of a very closed mentality. And that's what I really want to talk about at my talk. It's just about let's expand our mindset and get out of this little bubble. And a roadshow, even doing it with a small team of 4 or 5 and going around and collecting that data, listening to developers, telling you what their needs are, sharing that back into your engineering team is of such value.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to some active learning in your session at Index. I think it'll be really fun for developers and folks in the various communities to really hear what you're doing, because I think there's a ton to learn there. So I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you. I'm really excited speaking to the Index community.
By the way, submissions are now open to the IBM Q Awards, a series of prizes for professors, lecturers, and students who use the IBM Q experience and QuizKit in the classroom or for the research. The program consists of 4 separate contests: 1 for developing course materials for a lecture series, 2 building Jupyter Notebook tutorials with QuizKit, 3 publishing a scientific paper that makes use of QuizKit, open to students or postdocs, and finally contributing specific code modules to the QuizKit SDK. Selected submissions will be contributed to open source, and there are cash prizes, so be sure to check it out at ibm.biz/Q Awards. And speaking of IBM Q and quantum processing, here's a chat I had with Kevin Casey on his DeveloperWorks tutorial on how to take a step toward tapping into some of that power. So your tutorial that you've created here and using this game, I assume that part of your motivation was you just wanted to show people that they can actually tap into quantum processing right now through the cloud. Is that part of the motivation?
Yeah, Scott, that's correct. So, one of the things when I speak to other people about quantum computing is, they want to know what you can use it for. And it does, have some special sort of edge cases where it is actually a lot better than classical computing.
Okay.
And I was pondering the ways in which I could, demonstrate one of those ways and make it something tangible that, the everyday person would understand. So I created a little game that you can play on the internet that puts the quantum processor in the role of a person playing the classic con artist shell game. They have to find the ball underneath the shell.
All right.
So
go ahead and share if you want and then dig into it. We'd love to see how it works.
All right, great. All right. So this is the shell game. And similar to the classic con artist game, we are going to place a ball underneath one of these cups. Let's say we were to put it underneath cup number 3. Now we're going to allow the quantum computer to actually figure out where that ball is located. If this was a classical computer, it would perform basically an unstructured search. And by that I mean it would start with cup number 1, and it would flip cup number 1 over and say, is there a ball there? Yes or no. If it isn't, it goes to the next cup. If it is, yeah, great, we found the ball. It's over. The unstructured search has found the ball. So a classical computer, at worst case, would be able to would have to look under all 4 cups, assuming you hit the ball under number 4. Right? The quantum computer does things a bit differently. The power of it, we won't see it with 4 cups, but if we had 4 million or 4 billion or 4 trillion cups to look under, the quantum computer would beat the classical computer hands down. And that's because it can actually use a little technique called amplitude amplification to basically look at all the states of all the cups at the same time. And based on the probability waves that the quantum processor is using in its computations, can actually discern where the ball would be based on the size of those probability waves.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, so let me go ahead and click the little button here. And when we do this, just so you know what's happening, is in the background, we're going to take the state of the game. We're going to encode that into quantum assembler language called CHASM. And then we're going to wrap that up in a JSON package. I'm going to pass it to IBM's web API. IBM's obviously going to take that JSON, unravel it. It's going to pull out the quantum assembler code and then pass it to its quantum processor in its laboratory. And then it'll get the result back, again, in CHASM. It'll wrap that back up into a JSON format and pass it back to us. And voila, we'll have our answer. So let me go ahead and hit the compute button. And boom. So what we see here is the quantum processor computed that that we hit the ball under shell 3. And that is indeed where we put the ball. And, just for reference sake, so you can see what's going on the left here, this is the code that was passed in JSON format to the API. And this is the result that we got back. The interesting thing about this, Scott, is that there's very little code here going on that is not regular code. Any developer familiar with working with web APIs and JSON and passing JSON back and forth will recognize most of this code almost instantly. There's very little going on here that is that requires a little bit of sort of insider knowledge, and I'll go ahead and show some of this to you right now.
All right.
Now this is all available on GitHub, so you can go to GitHub. You can look at this code yourself and make changes and explore it as you see fit. In particular, what I want to show you here is the section of code that we use to create the CHASM code. And there's really 3 parts to it. There's sort of an initial section of CHASM code. We're including a library. We're setting up how many qubit registers and how many classical registers we're going to use in our experiment. And then we encode the state. So if you had selected cup number 3, this is the CASM code we'd use to encode that state. So, we'd set a Hadamard gate on qubit 1, a Hadamard gate on qubit 2, etc. And that is setting us up for the state where we've selected cup number 3. Then at the end, this is really the magic. This is Grover's algorithm being applied to these qubits. So irregardless of what state you've chosen, the application of this structure is the Grover's algorithm, and it's what produces the amplification, the amplitude amplification trick that actually solves for the unstructured search. So we put those 3 pieces of CASM code together. We return this back to the main program, which is calling this, and it's all submitted via web API pretty simply. It all comes back as JSON. We parse that JSON, and we display everything on the web page. So in short, it's a pretty simple thing, but it's really pretty cool in that we're, for free, accessing IBM's quantum platform and actually using some very cool and different types of computing tricks that aren't possible on a classical computer.
Kevin, this is terrific, and we certainly want to encourage people to check out the IBM Q experience on their own and see how they can utilize the power of quantum processing, and check out your tutorial. Both links are right here on the screen, and you'll find them in the show notes. And they can get the code, right? You posted the code on GitHub, so people. Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah, it's available. Yep.
All right. Thank you so much for doing this, man. We really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. It's my pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
Dogs. They know to eat. They appreciate attention, but enjoy their solitude as well. In many ways, they're just like people, with a few exceptions. One is, they can't write code. But if they could, they'd be going to Index San Francisco, February 20th through 22nd. Come to Index and learn and share with a wide variety of developers and thought leaders in an event designed entirely for developers. Do it for yourself, and do it for your dog.
Robin Wood is our DeveloperWorks Analytics and DevOps editor. Here is her interview with a DeveloperWorks contributing author on another Kubernetes-related piece.
Hi, everyone. Today I'm here with Rakesh Jain. He is a senior research engineer and architect at IBM and the author of 10 Steps to Set Up a Multi-Data Center Cassandra Cluster on a Kubernetes Platform. What inspired you to write this tutorial?
Actually, I was working on a project in which they were using Kubernetes, Cassandra. They were running in their own data center, multiple data centers, and they wanted a disaster recovery solution from me. But there was nothing in terms of setting Cassandra on top of Kubernetes with multiple sites or multiple data centers. So I tried that out. That seems to be a very powerful feature of Cassandra. And that worked out pretty well. And I thought, because it is all open source, it's actually something I could contribute to the open source community as well.
Can you give a quick summary of the tutorial?
In the tutorial, I have tried to actually keep it as simple as possible. All you need is a Kubernetes cluster, which is spanned over multiple data centers. In that, I have given scripts on how to set up Cassandra across those data centers as one cluster. Other thing is that you can basically insert data on one side and then retrieve it from the other side just to make sure it works. And you can actually bring down one whole site, basically one part of the Kubernetes cluster, and still be able to insert or retrieve data from the other side. So that's the whole setup with all the scripts I have provided in this tutorial.
All right. So one part can go down, but you can still retrieve and test data on the other.
Exactly, yeah.
That's great. So that's one of the problems it solves for developers. Any others?
Yeah. So if you have an application like this where you are running across, multiple regions, in different geos maybe, it is sometimes, it's very important that apart from, one side going down, there is also a latency issue. So you want to make sure that you can, your application in data center 1 uses the local Cassandra nodes, and your application on another data center uses that local data center nodes of Cassandra, so that the latency in retrieving or writing to Cassandra is not too much. But in the background, Cassandra takes care of doing replication to other sites. And it's not just 2 sites. If you have multiple, that's also fine. I think that is another advantage of using this approach. And overall, basically it's providing you a live backup facility without actually relying on underlying storage system to do replication for you. So it's built into Cassandra. So it's a very powerful feature of Cassandra.
Yeah, it sounds great. Any prerequisite knowledge? I mean, it sounds pretty robust. You need to be really technical, or can the beginner jump in and follow your steps?
Actually, all you need to know is Kubernetes. If you know Kubernetes, the instructions are pretty straightforward. In fact, on GitHub, I have provided all the step-by-step instructions you have to do in order to make it work. You don't even have to know too much about Cassandra, because all we are doing is deploying Cassandra. We are not actually worried about partitioning data in Cassandra or how to query Cassandra data. Not all of that. Very little, just to test it out. But besides that, all you need to know is Kubernetes and some concepts within Kubernetes like pods and stateful sets and persistent volumes and volume claims and things like that.
All right. So not too much knowledge beyond Kubernetes. Solves multiple problems: latency, geographically distributed teams, something going down but still being able to get the data, live backups. Sounds pretty good.
Definitely.
Okay, I'm on now with Doug Tidwell, who is host of the DeveloperWorks Mailbag series. Doug, the latest episode is on Kubernetes. What is Kubernetes?
Well, Kubernetes is a clustering technology for containers. For most folks, that means running Docker containers inside a Kubernetes cluster. As somebody said at KubeCon last month, where you and I were in Austin, these are exciting times for boring infrastructure. I love that line because Kubernetes takes care of so many things for you, so that as a developer, you can focus on writing your code, making sure it does what you want, and then let the tools package that up, put it in a Docker image, and then deploy the Docker image to a Kubernetes cluster.
That must make your life much easier as a developer. I assume that's why you wanted to talk about it in this episode, huh?
It is, and I think that's why it's become so popular. Most developers, I'm certainly among them, I don't want to know networking and operations and all that kind of stuff. I just want to write code. That's all I want to do. And Kubernetes gets me much closer to that ideal where I can be irresponsible and just do the things I like to do and have the system take care of the rest.
Now, you're going to love the DeveloperWorks Mailbag series of Doug Tidwell. Doug brings his own special brand of humor and entertainment value to the series, including some very custom-made commercials that he creates from thin air. Am I right? Like in this episode, it's DeveloperWorks anchovy paste. Am I right?
Yes, that is correct. The taste of our fish-based paste will put a smile on your face.
Put a smile on your face. If people will check out this episode of the DeveloperWorks Mailbag, you'll be able to find out about Kubernetes and also about Doug's fun approach to making video. So check it out at the show notes link. It's ibm.biz/ondw102, as you see on the screen, and you'll see a direct link to Doug's series and to that current episode on Kubernetes. Doug, thanks for taking time for us.
My pleasure, Scott. Always great to talk to you.
Well, that's it for this episode of On DeveloperWorks. Be sure to check the show notes page at ibm.biz/ondw102 for resource links around everything you heard about, including individual segment replays and the entire show replay. So you can share it anywhere and in whatever form you desire. And if you haven't signed up yet for the Index Open Developer Community event, there's still time. It's happening next week, February 20th through 22nd at Moscone West in San Francisco. 3 days to prepare.